For 20 long years, the land of Israel lived under a shadow that refused to lift. Villages grew quiet. Roads emptied. Fear became part of everyday life. Over the region ruled Jabin, king of Canaan, and enforcing his power was his feared commander, Sisera, a man whose army possessed an advantage no one in Israel could match. 900 iron chariots. In an age where battles were fought on foot, these machines represented unstoppable force. Wherever they rolled, resistance collapsed. Each chariot was more than a weapon. It was a message. You cannot win. You cannot escape. Generation after generation learned to lower their voices and their expectations. Courage faded, not because the people lacked faith entirely, but because hope had been worn thin by time. When oppression lasts long enough, it begins to feel permanent, and that is when fear becomes most dangerous. But history shows that the darkest moments are often the quietest, just before change begins. When power seems absolute and silence fills the land, something unseen is already stirring. Israel's story does not remain one of defeat. In the midst of overwhelming control, when strength and numbers mean nothing, a different kind of leadership is about to rise, one that does not rely on weapons or force, but on faith, clarity, and obedience. This is the moment where the story truly begins. Not with an army marching, but with a calling. Not with thunder from the battlefield, but with a voice that refuses to be silent. Stay with us as we uncover how a nation on the brink of destruction found deliverance in the most unexpected way. If stories like this inspire you, help us share them with more people. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful journey through history and faith. Yet the weight pressing down on Israel was not born from iron chariots alone. The rule of Jabin and the terror carried by Sisera were only the surface of a far deeper wound. One that had been forming quietly within the heart of the nation long before foreign power took control. What unfolded during those 20 years was not simply political domination, but the outward expression of a spiritual unraveling that had gone unaddressed for generations. Israel had once been bound by a covenant, a living relationship shaped by trust, obedience, and remembrance. That covenant had defined who they were and why they existed as a people. But over time, familiarity dulled devotion. Altars to other gods appeared where prayers to the Lord once rose. Customs borrowed from surrounding nations slowly replaced the laws that had set Israel apart. No single moment marked the turning point. Instead, compromise crept in quietly, wrapped in convenience and forgetfulness. The people did not wake up one morning having abandoned their faith. They drifted, step by step, until the distance became impossible to ignore. When the covenant weakened, so did their sense of identity. Without spiritual clarity, leadership faltered, and unity fractured. Fear found fertile ground in hearts no longer anchored by trust in God. In this state, Israel was vulnerable, not because they lacked strength, but because they had lost direction. The rise of Canaanite power did not come as a sudden invasion of an innocent land. It arrived as a consequence, the natural result of a nation that had forgotten the source of its protection. Oppression, then, became a mirror. Every iron chariot rolling across the plains reflected something deeper than military defeat. It reflected a broken relationship. The silence of heaven that followed was not absence, but restraint, allowing Israel to feel the weight of its choices. And in that silence, the people learned what comfort without faith truly cost. Fields could be worked, children could grow, but peace remained out of reach. The land functioned, yet it did not flourish. Still, even in that long season of hardship, the covenant was not erased. It waited, patient and unbroken, for the moment when recognition would replace denial. Slowly, the suffering did what prosperity never could. It stripped away illusion and exposed longing. The people began to remember the stories of deliverance spoken by their ancestors. Stories of seas divided and walls fallen without siege engines or chariots. Memory awakened grief, and grief opened the door to repentance. Their cries were not polished prayers. They were raw, desperate, and uneven, shaped by years of fear and regret. Yet they carried something powerful: honesty. Israel did not argue its innocence or bargain its way back into favor. It simply acknowledged its need. And that acknowledgement marked the turning point of the story. Even though no visible change came at first, what followed was not an immediate rescue, but preparation. Long before armies would move or storms would gather, something unseen began to shift. God's response to Israel's spiritual return was not loud or dramatic. It was deliberate. While the people cried out, a leader was being positioned, not in a palace or a training ground, but in quiet faithfulness. The solution to Israel's oppression would not mirror the force that oppressed them. It would rise from obedience rather than power, from listening rather than commanding. In that tension between consequence and mercy, between discipline and hope, the stage was set. The oppression that began as a political crisis was about to be answered by a spiritual awakening. And from that awakening, a story would unfold that proved Israel's greatest threat had never been Sisera's chariots, but the distance they had allowed to grow between themselves and their God. Out of that long season of silence and spiritual reckoning, a different kind of leader began to take shape, one who did not rise through conquest or command but through clarity and trust. While Israel still lived beneath the weight of oppression, while iron chariots continued to patrol the valleys and fear lingered in every village, Deborah was already standing in a place of quiet authority. Her emergence did not announce itself with banners or threats. It unfolded naturally, almost gently, as people began to recognize something steady and unshakable in her presence. Deborah was a prophetess, one who listened before she spoke. In a time when confusion clouded judgment and fear distorted truth, her greatest strength was discernment. She did not react to circumstances. She interpreted them through faith. Those who came to her were not seeking military strategies or political rebellion. They came carrying disputes, questions, and burdens shaped by years of uncertainty. Beneath the shade of a palm tree, far from thrones and fortified walls, Deborah offered something Israel had been missing for a long time: wisdom rooted in divine guidance. Her authority was not enforced, it was invited. Men and women approached her because her words brought order where chaos had reigned and peace where fear had taken hold. She judged not with harshness, but with insight, revealing how deeply leadership depends on understanding rather than control. In a culture shaped by hierarchy and power, Deborah represented a reminder of an older truth, that God's authority does not always align with human expectations. Sometimes it appears in humility, patience, and quiet confidence. What made Deborah's leadership remarkable was not simply that she was a woman in a male-dominated world, but that she led without trying to imitate the structures that had failed Israel. She did not attempt to match Canaanite strength with Israelite force. Instead, she restored spiritual alignment. Where others focused on what Israel lacked, she focused on who God was and who the people were meant to be. Her faith was not theoretical, it was lived, steady, and visible, shaping every decision she made. As judge, Deborah became a bridge between heaven and earth, translating divine truth into practical guidance for a fractured nation. Her prophetic insight gave her courage, and that courage, in turn, gave others permission to hope again. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. Fear did not disappear overnight, but it loosened its grip. The people began to sense that their story was not finished, that oppression did not have the final word. Deborah's leadership also revealed an essential truth about power. Military strength had dominated Israel's landscape for decades, yet it had not secured peace, justice, or stability. Deborah possessed none of the symbols of force that Sisera commanded, yet her influence reached deeper and lasted longer. Her words carried weight because they were anchored in obedience. She did not speak to elevate herself, but to align the nation with God's purpose. In doing, she redefined what it meant to lead. When Deborah spoke, it was not to incite rebellion driven by anger, but to awaken responsibility shaped by faith. She understood that true deliverance would not come from reckless action, but from trust in divine timing. Her calm confidence stood in sharp contrast to the anxiety that ruled the land. While chariots inspired fear through noise and speed, Deborah inspired courage through stillness and certainty. In that space between oppression and deliverance, Deborah became a living answer to Israel's cries. She did not rush the moment or force the outcome. She waited, listened, and spoke when the time was right. Through her, Israel began to see that leadership rooted in wisdom and faith could succeed where weapons had failed. And in that realization, the foundation was laid for a turning point that would soon reshape the destiny of the nation. When the moment of confrontation finally arrived, everything appeared to favor Sisera. The plains near the Kishon River stretched wide and open, the kind of terrain his iron chariots were built to dominate. For years, those chariots had been instruments of fear, their presence alone enough to scatter resistance before a battle ever began. To many watching from a distance, it seemed unthinkable that Israel would choose this place to stand. And yet, guided by Deborah's calm certainty and Barak's renewed resolve, the people moved forward, not because the odds had changed, but because their trust had. As the armies positioned themselves, the air felt heavy with tension. Sisera's forces stood confident, accustomed to victory, secure in the advantage that had never failed them before. Israel's men, by contrast, carried weapons that could not compare, their strength drawn not from experience but from conviction. The valley waited in silence, as though creation itself was holding its breath. What neither army could fully grasp was that the battle about to unfold would not be decided by skill or numbers, but by intervention beyond human control. Without warning, the sky began to shift. Clouds gathered where moments before there had been clear light, rolling in with a weight that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The wind rose, not as a gentle breeze, but as a force that carried urgency. Then the rain came, sudden and relentless, soaking the ground faster than it could absorb. The Kishon River, usually manageable and predictable, began to swell, its banks struggling to contain the surge. What had been firm earth turned soft beneath the pounding water. For Sisera's chariots, this change was catastrophic. Designed for speed and stability on dry ground, they now struggled against mud and flooding. Wheels that once symbolized unstoppable power sank and locked. Horses panicked, and formations fractured. Confusion spread quickly, replacing confidence with disarray. The very tools that had secured dominance for 2 decades became liabilities, trapping their own army in chaos. What no weapon could accomplish, the storm achieved in moments. For Israel, the storm told a different story. What might have inspired fear instead ignited courage. They recognized the shift not as misfortune, but as favor. Deborah's words echoed in their minds, affirming that the moment they had waited for had arrived. The rain did not weaken them. It freed them from fear, as Sisera's forces struggled to regain control. Israel moved, not recklessly, but with renewed clarity. The battlefield transformed into a place where faith met action. This was no random change in weather, no coincidence of timing. The storm felt purposeful, as though the land itself had aligned with the will of God. The river became an ally, the rain a weapon, and the sky a witness. In that moment, Israel understood something that had been forgotten during years of oppression. Their deliverance was never meant to mirror the strength of their enemy. It was meant to surpass it in a way that left no doubt about its source. As the battle unfolded, Sisera's advantage dissolved completely. What had once inspired terror now fueled desperation. The iron chariots, symbols of absolute control, were rendered useless by forces no army could command. Victory no longer depended on technology or tactics, but on the recognition that power rooted in fear cannot stand against purpose rooted in faith. When the fighting finally subsided, the outcome was undeniable. The storm had changed everything. It had stripped away illusions of invincibility and revealed where true authority resided. Near the Kishon River, Israel did not merely win a battle. They witnessed a restoration of trust, a reminder that their future was shaped not by the strength of their enemies, but by the faithfulness of their God. As the storm loosened its grip on the battlefield and the noise of conflict faded into scattered echoes, the story did not conclude with celebration or pursuit alone. Sisera, once the embodiment of Canaanite dominance, had survived the chaos only by abandoning everything that had defined his power. His chariot lay useless in the mud, his army scattered, his authority reduced to instinct and fear. Moving on foot, soaked and exhausted, he fled the place where he had once commanded terror, searching not for victory, but for refuge. His path led him away from the battlefield and toward the quiet edges of the land, where the tents of the Canaanites stood. This choice felt safe to him. The Canaanites were not Israelites, and their household had maintained peaceful relations with Canaan. To Sisera, this seemed like neutral ground, a place where the storm and the pursuit might finally end. What he did not know was that the unfolding of events had already moved beyond strategy and chance. Deborah's words, spoken earlier with calm certainty, were still at work. At the entrance of one of those tents stood Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. She was not a soldier, nor a figure of public authority. Her life, like many others, had unfolded in the ordinary rhythms of daily survival. Yet in this moment, the ordinary intersected with the extraordinary. When Sisera approached, desperate and drained, Jael received him with composed hospitality. Her voice was steady, her manner reassuring, offering rest where he expected danger. Trust came easily to him, perhaps because he no longer had the strength to question it. Inside the tent, the world grew quiet. Jael covered him, listened to his requests, and gave him something to drink. Exhaustion soon overtook him, and sleep followed quickly. Heavy and unguarded, the storm outside had passed, but another kind of stillness settled within the tent. In that silence, a decision formed, shaped not by impulse, but by awareness. Jael understood who lay before her and what his survival would mean for others. The oppression that had defined Israel's suffering for years rested, vulnerable and unaware, within her reach. What happened next was swift and decisive, carried out with tools familiar to her life, not weapons of war. In a single act, Sisera's escape ended, and with it, the authority that had terrorized a nation for 2 decades. The act was not loud, nor did it seek recognition. It was final, and it carried a weight far greater than the space in which it occurred. Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of a tent, through the hand of a woman no one would have expected to shape history. When Barak arrived in pursuit, still driven by urgency, Jael met him calmly. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her words. She simply showed him what had already been done. The victory was complete, not because an enemy had fallen, but because the source of fear had been removed. Sisera's death marked the collapse of Canaanite control, not through strength matching strength, but through obedience aligning with purpose. Jael's role revealed a pattern woven throughout the story of deliverance. God had not relied on rank, lineage, or military skill. Instead, he had worked through willingness and timing, choosing vessels overlooked by expectation. Deborah had spoken the truth, Barak had acted in faith, and Jael had completed what was set in motion long before the storm gathered. Each played a part, distinct yet connected, forming a narrative that defied conventional power. With Sisera gone, The weight over Israel began to lift. Oppression did not vanish in a moment, but its foundation had been broken. The story that began with fear and silence now moved toward peace and restoration. And at its center stood a reminder that history is often changed not by those who seek greatness, but by those who recognize the moment when obedience matters most. When the dust finally settled and the storm clouds broke apart, Deborah did not step forward to claim credit or elevate herself above the people. Instead, she lifted her voice in song. What followed in Judges chapter 5 was more than a celebration of victory. It was a declaration of meaning. The song of Deborah transformed a moment of military triumph into a lasting lesson, reminding Israel that their deliverance did not come from strength, numbers, or strategy, but from the hand of God responding to obedience. Her song begins by giving honor where it belongs. Before praising leaders or warriors, Deborah acknowledges God as the source of rescue. She recalls how the land once trembled in fear and how the heavens themselves responded when the Lord moved on behalf of his people. This perspective reframes the entire story. The battle was never just about Israel versus Canaan. It was about faith confronting fear and trust overcoming despair. By placing God at the center, Deborah ensures that the people would remember why victory came, not just how it happened. At the same time, the song honors courage. Deborah names the tribes and individuals who responded when the call came, celebrating those who risked themselves for the sake of freedom. Their willingness to rise is remembered as an act of faith, not heroism for its own sake. Courage, in her song, is not loud or self-promoting. It is the quiet decision to act when fear would be easier. Through her words, bravery becomes something accessible, something rooted in obedience rather than confidence. Yet Deborah's song does not avoid uncomfortable truth. She also speaks of those who stayed behind, who chose safety over responsibility. Their absence is not hidden or softened. By naming passivity, Deborah makes it clear that neutrality in moments of injustice carries consequences. The song stands as both celebration and warning, reminding future generations that silence and delay can shape history just as powerfully as action. Perhaps the most enduring message of the song is found in who it elevates. Deborah blesses Jael, a woman with no status or title, whose obedience brought the story to its conclusion. In doing, the song teaches that God's purposes are not limited by background, position, or expectation. Deliverance came through unexpected people, because they were willing to act when the moment arrived. The focus is not on who they were, but on what they trusted. As Deborah's song closes, it points beyond the battle toward a future shaped by faithfulness. Peace follows not because enemies are gone forever, but because the people have been reminded of who they are and who leads them. The land rests, and memory takes root. The story becomes a reference point, a reminder that obedience can shift the course of history. Thank you for taking this journey with us through the story of Deborah. If this message encouraged or inspired you, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more stories that bring history and faith together. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives with others.